Hello, I'm Dr. Stephen Hassan with an episode of the new rebranded Cult Conversations, the Influence Continuum with Dr. Steve Hassan. And I have two very fascinating, important guests with me today. They wrote this important book called Framed, Women in the Family Court Underworld. Dr. Christine Cocchiola and Amy Polacko has written this very, very important book. And I want to just read a little bit about both of you before we get into it. Christine Marie Cocchiola has a doctorate in social work, is a licensed clinical social worker, has been a social justice advocate since the age of 19 as a domestic abuse, sexual assault crisis counselor, and a child welfare advocate. She's served as the board member on the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence and has been actively supporting codifying coercive control as the foundation of domestic abuse, writing policy briefs supporting these efforts, providing expert testimony at legislative hearings. And she's a college professor who's been teaching social work for 20 years, creator of the Protective Parenting Program. You have an online course for clinicians. We've met personally, and I've attended your sessions at the ICSA conference, Christine. Welcome to the Influence Continuum. And Amy is an award-winning journalist, investigative reporter, and divorce coach who survived the narcissist nightmare herself. After her own experience, she formed the Freedom Warrior Coaching to become the guide she wished she had. You have a master's from Columbia University School of Journalism, was part of a Pulitzer Prize-winning reporting team. You've coached hundreds of women through divorce. Your work has been cited by major publications, and you've created a digital course called Divorce Decoded to educate divorcing women about the process warnings about family court. So we want people to buy this fine book. I have already given it to a personal friend who is surviving a toxic, divorce. Yes, good for holding it up. And I guess I want to state that a lot of people think about mind control and coercive control in terms of religious cults, but we're going to talk about one-on-one domestic relationships of abuse, especially where women are being harmed, gaslighted, manipulated, children poisoned against them. So with that, I will stop talking. And Christine Cocchiola, Dr. Christine, please take it over and share with my listeners.
Sure. So, Amy and I have been working for a long time with people who need support when they're leaving abusive relationships. And what we figured out is that it's an epidemic. Basically, that's what this comes down to, and a lot of people aren't talking about how the systems are often complicit in not protecting children and mothers in particular. Certainly, we know this happens to men. It does. Mm-hmm. But Steve, the world is set up in a way that patriarchy is foundational in most systems. And so men have more power. They just do. And most of these systems are run in general by patriarchal norms. And so we decided we wanted to sit down. We wanted to gather up. It's basically a case study book. It's 22 stories of protective mothers and their children. And the stories are horrifying, frankly. They're hard to read, but they are the stories we hear every single day. Right, Amy?
Absolutely. I think that we say all the time we wrote this book for 3 reasons. One is to validate for the people going through it that we see you, we hear you, you're not crazy. You are not an anomaly by any means. Secondly, there is a huge preventative factor. We want people to read this. Women and men out there dating, maybe you're married and you're seeing some things that are off. You need to know what to look for and what to expect if you end up in the family court system. And then last but not least, we really hope that this helps propel the movement for change in family court. We hope that people are ticked off, quite frankly, by the time they get to the end and they get to our call to action and they do take action.
Yeah, absolutely. And, my vested interest on why I got my second master's and PhD was to update the law, because the law is 100 years out of date at least, saying if you turn 18, then you can control your own choices completely. Or if you're a minor, then you can be unduly influenced, or an elderly person with dementia. But otherwise, it's a slippery slope. And experts are able to say, no, there are very specific behaviors that are red flags. And of course, I have my BITE model of authoritarian control that looks at behavior, information, thought, and emotional control in terms of controlling people. So with that frame in mind, people need to get out of this false notion that only weak, stupid, uneducated people can be mind controlled or coercively controlled. And with that, I'd like maybe Dr. Cocchiola, you can share a story and read something from the book that might get people more motivated to pick it up and buy it and listen to it.
Sure. So I think what's important to recognize, right, is so I've been doing this work since the age of 19. I've been an advocate, volunteer for a local domestic abuse agency for over 35 years, teaching on this subject every single semester, yet I didn't know it was happening to me. And here's the reason why. We look through the violent incident model when we think about abuse. And frankly, that's archaic because abusers do not show up being physically abusive initially, right. Usually. Initially, they are often using psychological tactics, just as you know. So we have to look beyond the violent incident model. And if it can happen to me, and I'm not trying to say I'm super smart and savvy, but I'm like,
but
come on.
I
but here's the deal. I was teaching on it every semester. I'm a therapist helping other people in these circumstances, yet couldn't see it occurring in my own dynamic. And the court system certainly doesn't acknowledge it, that these things can occur insidiously, very nuanced, and then all of a sudden a victim is reactive. You know what happens. When victims are reactive, we point the finger at them. We say, what's wrong with you? How come you're behaving this way? Well, when you're trapped ongoing for a long period of time, you're going to react. You're going to react. And that's what we know. So we are so grateful. Dr. Ramani Deversala wrote our foreword. And as you know, she's a narcissistic abuse expert internationally. Tina Swithin wrote our epilogue. She is a social justice advocate who has propelled this world of understanding family court. She says this book should be a prerequisite for all women. And we say any man who cares about women, who cares about the experiences of victims and survivors. And again, this can happen to men. I have many male clients. Many, and most of them are gay. However, I have men who have been experiencing this in a heterosexual world also. So I thought maybe I could read
them too, but they're afraid and stigmatized to say, yeah, I was in this controlling relationship with my wife and she isolated me from my family and she controlled the money, and just the lists are exactly the same thing, but they're so ashamed and embarrassed.
It's so true. Men are silenced also. Yeah. Yes. So
please.
I thought I'd read just a little bit about the introduction where I talk about coercive control. So you may ask, why doesn't a protective parent and her attorney tell the court what is occurring? Often attorneys and court professionals are not invested in victims' experiences. The family court process is profitable, as Bandy Lee talks about in her podcast with you and in other places also. And there's a good old boys club that permeates due to patriarchy. When abuse is covert, it is challenging for victims themselves to recognize their own loss of autonomy. And even when there is overt coercive control in the form of physical violence or sexual violence, verbal assaults and stalking, the experiences are diminished by family court, with adult victims of abuse disbelieved for their own abuse and disbelieved at a greater rate when the perpetrator has abused the children. You know, Steve, we have research affirming now that victims and survivors, when they express that they've experienced domestic abuse in the family court system, they are disbelieved at a rate of about 55%. And then when they disclose their children being physically abused, they're disbelieved, or they're believed at a rate of about 23%. I mean, 23 out of 100%. And then if they disclose sexual abuse of their children, and I say this course, Family Court is giving child predators carte blanche, absolute freedom. Women are disbelieved at a rate of 85% when they disclose sexual abuse of their children. This is horrifying. And it's an
horrifying.
Oh my gosh. And it's an intergenerational trauma that could be totally prevented if we understood the pathology of abusers, which I know is exactly what you're always trying to educate on.
Yeah, and let me just comment, kudos to you for having Dr. Romani Dervasella do an intro, because she's world famous on narcissism. And the traits of narcissists, aside from the self-entitlement and the grandiosity and the need for praise and admiration, is lack of empathy. And so they're skilled at acting roles, but they really don't feel for the other. So, and when I helped to co-develop the Ending the Game program for sexual trafficking victims, part of what I was teaching was that these young girls, 12 to 14, often recruited by pimps, they believed their pimp loved them. So part of the education is explaining narcissism. They don't give a damn about you. They are using you. And to really step into the mind of a predator and understand, the techniques of manipulation. And the only way for sex trafficking survivors is to end the game, meaning get out, get away from this creep.
So true.
So I love your work. So Amy, can we want to add in?
I do, because I think that you are absolutely right, Stephen. That's why we have 22 contributors from around the world, the US, Canada, the UK, and Australia, all different age groups, backgrounds. And we asked every one of them, tell us about when you met your partner, right? So yes, we've got the horrific family court story, and each one is different, though there is a common thread, which is the abuser's playbook that we put right here, because they do have a playbook. But we want to know how they duped you, right? How they got you, the love bombing, the gaslighting, the putting you on a pedestal, all those things that you are talking about, because we want to educate people so they can recognize this. And I think they will identify with some of these stories. I could read the beginning of one if you want, that demonstrates that. Okay. This one is called The Abuser's Playbook. That's the chapter, and it's Michelle. And I just want to preface, please keep in mind, this woman is a very accomplished business executive who you would never dream would end up in a situation like this. My name is Michelle, and I want a divorce. These are the very words that initiated my living hell. 3 years ago, I was free of debt, naive and trusting. Now, with over $300,000 in legal fees and deep in personal debt, I'm acutely aware of what can happen in divorce. Let me make something clear. You don't have free will in these coercively controlling narcissistic relationships. You are being controlled and dominated by someone in all aspects of your life. And it's by someone who's telling you they love you. It's coercive control. The confusion they create is powerful. I actually thought my husband, Jeremy, was the safe option. It was weird, though, that he didn't tell me he had been married before until we were engaged and moved together across the country. Then something happened at our wedding that really hurt my feelings, but he didn't care and took the side of his family. Looking back now, that should have been a huge red flag. And even though it would have been embarrassing, I should have walked away. We moved constantly for Jeremy's job, so mine was second priority, and our life was a roller coaster ride. Sometimes he was super nice, and other times he'd yell at me and call me names. We had several children, so it wasn't easy to leave. He isolated me from family and limited my friendships. But one day I visited a friend out of town and told her how he woke the kids up in the middle of the night to tell them, "Your mother's a whore and a bitch." I'll never forget the look on my friend's face when hearing this and her adamant warning, "You've got to get out of there." It was a mirror of my reality that I had carefully hidden for years. And she goes on, she's still trying to get divorced. She's on year 5. Year 5. She just wants a divorce.
Right.
So that's a little microcosm.
Yeah, and I want to just comment that, talking to a friend, someone outside of the immediate dynamic, gives you a perspective especially if it's a trusted friend. But controllers want to control your information and punish you if they hear you saying anything negative to anybody else.
Right.
But it's so subtle. And I think that along with the male dominated cultures around the world, I think there's also a push towards a fantasy where you meet Mr. Right and fall in love and your life is roses. And a lot of young women walk around wanting that fantasy because it's so intoxicating, but it's also not real. So, in my work, I always say, like, do the research before you get involved, and even hire a PI. Find out if they married, if there are lawsuits, if there's violence, etc. But now we have a tool that you've offered, the book Framed, where people thinking about getting married can have a conversation with their potential spouse and go, let's read this together. And if the person freaks out, then you don't want to marry this person.
I love the way you just said that.
Yeah, good point. Good, well said.
Well said.
I had that experience with combating cult mind control.
Yeah.
It's like when people say, I'm going to this group, but I don't know if it's bad or not. I say, bring in my book and say, hey, I'm reading this book. What do you think?
Mm-hmm.
And if they freak out, then you know to run away. And if they're like, oh, it's so interesting, let's share it, then it may be okay.
It's nice to meet you here.
No, it's like I was listening to this really interesting podcast with these two women who had, bright, talented, educated, accomplished women who got taken over by men that they thought loved them.
Yeah.
And I think very highly of myself, and I don't want that to happen to me.
That's right. That's right. And I think you're kind of highlighting this idea of shame too, right? Because what happens is we're ashamed to say that we've been taken advantage of. And by the way, nobody wants to believe the person they love and they've had children with is an abuser. Nobody wants to believe that. So we hold on to that, the breadcrumbs, the intermittent reinforcement will pull you in. There's a trauma bond that's created. People say, why don't these women leave? Because there's a neurological response in the brain. I mean, the brain is wanting you to feel safe with this person. The brain is not wanting you to feel like you're unsafe. And of course, if you've had children with this person, it's almost solidified for them. It's like a trap, right?
It absolutely is. I mean, you didn't, talk about sex, but having intimate relations with somebody, it really breaks down a lot of, normal defense boundaries of trust. And then we have oxytocin and all kinds of other scientific, hormones and chemicals that get released where we get bonded. But I'll also just add, a lot of times there's a financial safety net where you're afraid, especially if you have kids, to rock the boat because, where am I going to move to? How am I going to pay the bills becomes a factor.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, we know it takes on average an abuse victim 7 times to leave, right? I know we went back when looking back, hindsight's 2020. It's like, why did I do that? But you understand what someone's going through. And I think financial abuse is something is covered in many of these stories. And it's real because a lot of the victims have no idea what the family finances are. They're doled out an allowance. They're told to quit their jobs. And I think staying home is a noble and wonderful thing. As a divorce coach, I believe every person should have a prenup or a post-nup agreement that protects them, whether it's a man or a woman. They should have a salary going into an account that pays them for what they're doing. So they are not losing all of their power. I mean, I work with women, and I do have some male clients too, but mainly women who have no access to money to pay for an attorney or do anything. And that's the way the abuser wants it.
Yeah.
And that's where they often to have advantages in the family court because they can afford expensive attorneys and expert witnesses. And often women with kids are struggling and don't have the equal resources to match
And
it.
in my case, I was the workhorse. I was the one who was, the ex was not contributing as much to the fair share, to the family account. And I was working tons of extra hours to ensure we could have all of the things that we wanted to have as a family. And I think it's really important for your listeners, and you know this, of course, and I'm sure they've heard this from you over and over again, but a lot of times this abuse is so covert, you don't even know it's occurring, right? You don't even realize, oh, I'm working 2 extra jobs and that person's not contributing their fair share. And then you realize if you bring up the issue, it's going to create an argument.
Yeah.
It's going to be some kind of stonewalling is going to occur where you're not talked to for several days. And then it creates this experience. And I think for children, this is my particular niche, living in the home. We try so hard to protect them from what's actually occurring. But the problem with that is in some ways we're gaslighting them into a false belief about the family system and a belief about the abuser. Because if we don't want to believe the abuser's an abuser and we're protecting the children from that, I call it intuition disintegration. We are literally disintegrating their intuition. Like they are not able to truly feel at their core what is going on because we keep, in some ways, suppressing that. We keep saying everything's fine, or well, dad's just working late, or mom's just in a bad mood. Like mom needs sleep. Whoever the abuser is, we do a good job of covering it up so they don't feel the pain. And then people ask me, how did my child who watched horrible behaviors go on in our home and even physical violence, how did that child now all of a sudden align with the abuser? Well, the abuser was not, first of all, was protected by you, perhaps, but also the abuser did a really good job of covertly, insidiously indoctrinating that child, luring that child in, knowing that child will figure out that they are the more powerful person in the dynamic.
Yep. So many comments I want to make about this, but I really credit you, Dr. Cocchiola. You has taught me a lot since meeting you and learning from you, because I was operating on what the mental health professionals are taught, that you should never say bad things about the kid's parent, but you don't know they're telling bad things about you and telling the kid not to say anything to you, and it gets tricked. And the whole notion that children are actually picking up very clear signals of dysfunction. And it was a new concept for me that you taught me, that the mother is unwittingly collaborating with the abuser to maintain this illusion that everything's fine, and it gaslights the kids.
It does.
It's disconfirming their reality. Right. So thank you for your important contributions.
Thank you. And I think it's really important. I always add this little: we never disparage the abuser. There's a way to call out behaviors without ever disparaging the abuser, especially moms who are engaged in family court. We never want a judge to be able to say, well, why did you say that about the father? Or why? We can't. There's a way around it that we can give clarity to our kids without actually giving them the tools to say bad things about that other parent. And that's important. It's super important. And so how we remain safe, because the family court system never wants you to engage children in this process.
Right. And if you have proof that your spouse said mommy's a whore, as this excerpt is, that's useful to the judge of the other person, your soon to be ex, hopefully, is doing that. You want to read another story? Or do you want to add another personal thing in terms of your own journeys that might be captivating to our listeners?
Well, I think that while Dr. C is looking, I would just say that, in my work as a divorce coach, I'm seeing women, and like I said, a few men coming to this point where a breaking point that they want a divorce, and they have no idea what our family court world is like. And why would they? They've been married, right? So they have no idea. So they walk in with this conception that it's fair. I tell my side of the story, it's maybe something they see on TV in a legal drama. That is not reality. And I think, for me, one of the things that propelled me to do this work is my own experience in family court. And I really thought, this can't be happening in America. It was the twilight zone, people bragging about how much money they were making. It was, I couldn't believe it.
You mean lawyers?
Yeah.
Make how much lawyers were making? Or
the way they, treated, and I see this with my clients a lot, the way they're demeaned and they're treated. It can be for some attorneys, another level of abuse, and so I think, people need to be educated. And to Dr. C's point, they could say the wrong thing without even realizing how it could be misconstrued in this underworld. Right. And that's why we want them to know.
Yeah. And I think to Amy's point, I think that's what we hear every single day, is that lawyers and judges, Dr. Ramani calls it the industrial divorce complex, and that it takes two to tango. And she actually did a training, and I said we don't use the word high conflict because there's an assumption that there's two people that are high conflict. And she says she no longer uses that because she heard me state high conflict means one person's drawn towards abuse, drawn towards conflict. And so we have to figure out, we really have to, but lawyers are not necessarily interested in figuring out who the abuser is. I mean, this is the problem. And there's money to be made in family court. And the longer I'm engaged in the family court system, the more financial abuse I'm going to suffer, right? And so lawyers know this. I thought I'd read a little bit of, it's called A Life Sentence. It's Victoria's story from the United States, because Victoria's story is an example of a cult on a microcosm. So, I think of this as the cult of children, right? That they can get indoctrinated, etc. We also have these camps in our country called reunification camps, where children, where children can be sent off to a camp to convert their way of thinking about a parent they believe is an abuser. I'm sorry, I find this entirely horrifyingly egregious, that regardless if a child's thoughts are correct or incorrect, how could we force them to be removed from a parent they believe they have a secure attachment to, put them away at a camp? This mother, Victoria, did not see her children for 6 years. After the book was published, her children got in a car and drove to her house. And so these children were trapped with the abuser and forced into reunification camps, another huge money-making, profiting organization.
And these are uncertified, but judges can assign children.
So
the
question becomes, is there complicitness? I think the answer is absolutely yes. There's money to be made within the family court industry. And if I send children off and I am working with court professionals who align, and this is the other thing we hear over and over again, Steve, is that, a lot of court professionals, of course, have the best interests of children in mind, but some do not. And they automatically go for 50-50, even if there's been a history of abuse. How is that possible?
Right.
So in Victoria...
Yeah, exactly. If I can just say before you start reading that I've worked with boot camp cults where parents are tricked into spending huge amounts of money to send their kids because they got caught smoking a joint or something. But the behavior control, information, thought, and emotional control happens, and against the parents too. And I'm putting it out there to you to teach me more about these reunification camps, because I think we need to do a podcast featuring, because my sense is that it's about money and not about really truly caring about children.
So exactly, because if you're going to send a child away to conversion therapy, which, by the way, the book Saving Alex, which is about conversion therapy with Mormon religion, right? And a child who was gay was forced into conversion therapy. And the idea...
I hate the word therapy.
Yeah, I know they use it though, right? It's a term.
It's to brainwash people who are gay into thinking they're straight. I've done blogs and
Yes.
interviews on this topic
Yes.
already. And I'm about to do another interview with a forthcoming book about this topic. But
Yeah,
please
so
continue.
these children are forced, right? And then again, to the point, some parents who have had their children indoctrinated against them think that this repair or reunification camp is going to solve the problem. You can't coerce someone to think differently. That's not healthy. That's really harmful, as you know. So this woman, Victoria, says, my witnesses and experts would have given valuable information about me, the dangers of the unregulated and controversial family reunification therapies, including reunification camps, and critical information about the children's well-being, including the risk of being separated from their mother. Let me just say that this particular mother did not prevent her children from going. They just didn't want to go, but they went, and he still forced the reunification therapy. Justice demands the court should have allowed evidence and testimony from both parties, not just Rex, for such a serious decision as an effective termination of my parental rights by eliminating all contact and communication between me and the children indefinitely. I was prohibited from a fair hearing and from presenting any sort of defense about my actual behaviors with the children and their outcries. My former counsel expressed concern, saying this essentially is a shadow court, deciding and doing everything outside of this court, and we know nothing about it. Rex paid thousands of dollars for this family reunification camp expert, who explained to the court that the camp requires a minimum 90-day no contact order because in the early days they didn't have the 90-day exclusionary period, and they found that children relapsed sooner and that the favored parent was reintroduced, and so they made the 90-day no contact order and have found that it is a sufficient period of time. Now, what I would say as someone who specializes in attachment theory, how harmful is this to a child to maliciously, I've used this word before, fracture the attachment between a protective parent or someone they deem protective, whether they actually are or not? How harmful is that to maliciously fracture that attachment? This mom did not see her children for 6 years.
Yeah. So for my listeners, you're listening to a professor of social work who's been teaching for 20 years, and it happened to her, and this is an epidemic that's happening, and it happened to Amy as well. And so what I would like to ask you, if you don't mind, Dr. Cocchiola, to talk a little bit more about attachment theory, because in my work, it's such a fundamental concept, sense of self, especially for people born in authoritarian cults. I just recently interviewed a woman who was raised in the Children of God horrible sex cult. She later became a psychologist. She's in Australia. But the fracturing of attachments, where some people don't even know who their father is because they're in this commune. Can you speak a little bit about
Sure.
attachment
So,
theory?
I think the idea behind attachment theory is that children really bond and attach to a primary caretaker at the time of birth, or the time, that they're held by their parents in their arms. And it's such an important part of creating dynamics and relationships where you trust other people, you feel safe, you're able to take risks that are appropriate, right? And so it's really helpful. A lot of people think attachment is only created during that time, birth to 3, and that once it's created, like it's there. But the problem is that abusers come into family systems, and of course often are there at the inception of the family system, and that what they are doing is diminishing a protective parent in a way that is slowly over time. Dr. Evan Stark called coercive control. It's like carpenter ants devouring the foundation of a house. And it's such a great image because you don't know it's happening until it's too late. And so what happens oftentimes is when I always say the moment that the baby is held in the abuser's arms, in the protective parent's arms, the abuser knows at their core that they can never love that child in the same way. And they don't have the ability to, right? I mean, abusers have character traits that make it, they're unable to love in this unconditional, simply beautiful way. And they watch the protective parent and they can see that love. And of course, what does that do for them? It ignites their shame. It makes them feel less than. And then they know from that moment on that this is the one thing they can weaponize immediately if they need to. And so I believe abusers start day one, where they always know that that is what matters most. Of course it does. Amy always says it's the Achilles heel of every protective parent, right, Amy? Is that abusers know that that is what matters most to the protective parent. And so what can they do if they can't take away, if they cannot get that other partner to continually align with them, if that partner decides to try to escape, oh, I know what I'll do. I'm going to use that child against you. I'm going to weaponize that child. And if I started from the very beginning, as I know my ex did, and my children told me the day and the hour that he began to indoctrinate them against me, they were 9 and 10. So, I found out at 17 and 19. How many years of indoctrination, intimidation, isolation, a fracturing of the attachment was going on. Thank God the attachment was very strong because I was able to come back to that. And even if the attachment is strong, sometimes abusers are stronger. And so understanding that attachment can be something that we have, but that if someone is trying to maliciously fracture it over time and you don't know it, oh my gosh, they're more readily able to take it apart. And so if you think if any of your listeners think they're with an abuser, they think they've had an experience like this book that Amy and I have written, they think they've had that experience, they need to begin looking in and really focusing on what could be happening.
Yeah, and listen to other people's real life stories. And if you are identifying with what you're reading, I recently met a woman who I gave the book to, and she was crying throughout the book because she just didn't, the alignment of the beliefs, the validation from hearing other people's stories was so powerful. She told me. So that's really important. I guess I want to just add from my work with this population, which is not anywhere close to the level that you have been doing. I wonder if the narcissist is feeling when the child is born and he sees the child in the mother's arms is thinking, now I'm not the center of her attention anymore. And so jealousy creeps in and isn't just, I'm going to get her, but this need for attention and a search for ways to keep, that narcissistic supply happening, even if it's negative. Do you want to say something about that? I saw you nodding a lot.
Go ahead, Amy.
Well, I certainly don't have the clinical data on this that maybe Dr. C does, but I see this in my coaching practice and my support group I run all the time, is that is, and I think it's in some of our stories, right? That is a turning point. When they are no longer the center of attention and there's a new baby on the scene, that's when infidelity can start to happen. That's when they pull away. That's when some of this abuse ratchets up when you would think it would be the opposite. So I think we definitely see that. And as I'm always explaining this to my clients, that they need narcissistic supply, right? Even after a divorce, sometimes they're keeping you in the web for a reason. They still want to play with you like cat and mouse, even though they wanted a divorce. So,
and I would
say,
in my situation in particular, it was kind of a little bit of the opposite. So I went from being the center of attention, and then the children became the center of attention. So some abusers do not show up in this authoritarian style, even though they're omnipresent, right? And they are abusers. But what they show up is in more of this heroic, fun, engaging person. And the children became the center of attention. And I literally moved to the back seat. And I remember feeling that and thinking, what's happened to our relationship dynamic? Why am I not as important? And of course, as a woman saying, geez, things feel different. I don't feel as important. You could imagine how I was criticized by therapists, by my ex. Because what do you mean? You know, like, of course the children are important. Like, nobody could contextualize how much that shift had changed the relationship dynamic. And so I think abusers can definitely be jealous of the children, and exactly what Amy said. I think that happens a lot more frequently. But I also think there's this little subgroup of people who now just capitalize on the attention they can get from the children. And those children, by the way, end up having really, really positive childhood experiences. So you can imagine their attachment feels really secure to that abuser because of those. It's just a beautiful experience for them. They're the center of attention the whole time. And so how do they navigate when they figure out, oh my gosh, this person is an abuser? You could imagine the disassociation is that much greater, right? It's not like they've experienced and seen verbal assaults and physical violence, and, they're not, important. The parent doesn't go to their games or whatever, right? It's a different dynamic.
Well, yeah. So, I mean, there are patterns, right? That's what we're doing, pattern recognition. And so I wanted to say, if the abuser is thinking that they want to have an affair, they accuse the woman of wanting to have an affair. Like, that's a pattern that I see all the time, a projection of their own desires and impulses, etc. And then the other thing I wanted to ask you about is I've also witnessed where the truly responsible, loving parent is setting boundaries and rules, but the abuser is it's okay if you stay up late, or don't tell mom if we're going to do video games while she's away visiting. I see you nodding.
I'll just add, I was just talking to a coaching client about this last week because she's going through the divorce process and seeing this already. Because I think narcissistic parents tend to be very permissive parents because it's fun. It's fun to be the Disneyland dad or the Disneyland mom and not have to enforce any of the rules, be the one getting pushback when you're saying a homework or project is due. And I said to her, this is radical acceptance. You've got to accept this right now. You're the mama bear, or the ones who care, the protective parent, whoever that is the one that's making sure that stuff is getting done. Even though the child, and I have a 16-year-old teenager who is great, but we have moments. I'm the one who's on him, right? Do I hope he appreciates that ultimately? Yes, that's what I tell my clients. They know you're the one who cares and looking out for them.
Yeah, and I coach some of my clients when I can and have the opportunity to do a bifurcated. I'm using my two hands. A bifurcated message to the kids. Like, part of me wants to be like your father, having fun and not having any restrictions and whatever, but I have this other part that's mama bear that knows that the best way to help you grow up to be your best self is having rules and having boundaries and getting your work done at school. So as much as I'd like to just be doing the fun stuff, I feel like you're going to thank me later that I'm doing this. And just explaining to children why you're doing what you're doing and verbalizing the different feelings that you're having.
Sure.
Helpful.
I'll give you an example. I have a 14-year-old who's going out partying all the time because she lives with the abuser. She doesn't want to live with the mother. Of course she doesn't, because the abuser is giving her freedom, right? But this is the accommodations that we have to make as protective parents. Sometimes we're not parenting the same children. They've been abused, frankly. They're being abused by the abuser, right? They're being coerced and controlled in various ways. And so this mom made an agreement, which was a very hard, there's a grieving process in this, right? But we talked it through, and she made an agreement with her child that anytime her child's out at a party, she will come pick her up, high, drunk, it doesn't matter, and drop her off at her dad's. All she wants to do is make sure her child's safe. And so the way to, sometimes we have to change our rules as protected, because if you've got someone who's letting children do anything they want, and you are trying to hold the line that you originally thought you had with that partner, It's not going to work. Connection matters more than anything. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really, there's so much wisdom in what both of you have been sharing. And I'll just add from my work clinically to kind of go ahead in time to when they're grown up. You know, they'll thank you later. And if you're doing the behaviors that are showing consistent love, responsibility, care, and empowering them to grow up to be adults, because they will grow up. And you know, so people are like, yeah, my kid's in a cult and da, 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 da. He's been in for a bunch of years. And I'm like, well, they're going to leave. We can try to make it sooner and easier for them, but you want to demonstrate you care. And then if a parent says, but they've cut my kid off, I can't call, I can't send letters or emails or whatever, I say, write letters, write emails, do a journal, date it, do an entry at least once a week, because when they surface, however long, you can say, I was thinking of you all the time. I wanted you in my life. I didn't have access to you, but here it is. And it's so therapeutic when people do come out to see piles of letters, and back in snail mail days, I would say, make a copy, like mail it, but keep a copy.
Yeah.
And then if the person says, I never got them, you never sent one, it's like, here they are. Here are the copies that I made. And it's very powerful.
Right. No, absolutely. And I think people should know that in Framed, we have books, we have stories of moms who are not seeing their children. We have stories of mom who regained custody. We have stories of moms who lost custody. I mean, there's a variation here. We have moms who were, quote unquote, alienated by the abuser, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then accused of alienation, which is a really significant problem that's happening in the family court system, where unfortunately fathers' rights groups are capitalizing on this term, and they're using it immediately. Even if a mother's come forward with abuse, they're saying they've been alienated, and that's hugely problematic, because the court is automatically thinking this is a dad who deserves time, instead of looking at the history of the coercion and control.
Yeah. So I'm going to throw an odd ball to you, because it's been on my mind a lot the last few months, and that is the deleterious effects of social media on young people's minds, and how Australia has recently passed a law banning social media for under 16-year-olds. So can you talk about that? Because for me, it's like so alien to the human experience to be in pixels and with bots. And there was a 13-year-old who killed himself. He fell in love with a character.ai entity that encouraged him to join her, and he killed himself.
I saw that.
And there's a lawsuit. I have an interview with one of the lawyers that's suing the social media organization. So please share some thoughts that you have about this wacky digital world that we're now is the big context of the change on psychology.
Amy?
Nope. I think this is in your expertise.
Sure. So,
Doc, you're up.
Yeah. So I just think it's, I think what we know is that it's harmful, and it's like everything else. We figure it out 10 years after we've already been causing harm. Isn't that the truth, right? Or 15 years after we've been causing harm. I mean, the addiction, right? It's like cocaine on the brain. I mean, I have a lot of protective moms who say to me, I take away their phone and they lose their minds. I'm like, yeah, because they're addicted to their phones. You can't take away phones anymore. If you didn't start off when they were really young having a docking station, it's too late now. You have to figure out something else, because it is something that they can't prevent themselves from getting very upset about. And it's silly to create another argument or problem. But the addiction to social media, I read somewhere recently online that kids are getting up to 200 notifications a day. Can you imagine how much of an influx that is on the brain, right? And so I guess I just think I'm excited that Australia is recognizing it. I'm seeing some schools in the United States who are banning cell phones in the schools.
Yes.
This is amazing. I think this is going to be the conversation 10 years from now. do you remember years ago that people could drive intoxicated and they wouldn't be arrested? They wouldn't, right? Like they just get pulled over. They might get a ticket. I mean, it changed over time.
Right.
This is where we are now.
Mothers Against Drunk Driving
Exactly.
changed the law.
Exactly. So I think we're in the midst of this change. Lila Mickelwait's fantastic book, Take Down Pornhub, what we found about pornography online.
I interviewed her.
Oh my God, amazing.
Fantastic.
She's amazing. And the reality that 8-year-olds have access to this information, like there's just so much education that needs to happen. And all I can say is I feel extremely strongly about the influence of social media on young people. And I'm sure Amy with a 16-year-old certainly can concur on that. Yeah.
I definitely do. And I think that, we say this all the time, but the parents have to be involved into what's going on. I mean, I will look at my son's phone. I will see what he's up to. I have limits on things. I've been making him put the phone down and read the sports section of the New York Times or whatever. Like you need an escape from technology, right? But, I also have the perspective as a single mom with an only child who in the pandemic, that was his way to communicate with other kids. And so I think there are good parts to having a phone, right? But it's all within limits. You can't just let them, go hog wild. It's like I wouldn't let my son have a TV in his room until he reached a certain age, because I think it's too tempting, right? To be watching it all the time.
Or a computer in his room.
It's precisely
you can watch everything in there. It's so I'm a big fan of the Center for Humane Technology, who's trying to rein in AI and social media. They did the documentary The Social Dilemma, which I highly recommend parents watch with their kids. And then The Great Hack and People You May Know are two other documentaries I recommend parents watch with their kids. The Great Hack was about the Cambridge Analytica hack of Facebook, where everybody's personal data was taken. And People You May Know is about this company in Colorado that buys people's information on the dark web and sells it to cults and other bad actors. And we used to say to our kids, don't get into a car with a stranger, don't ever, give a credit card number to a stranger on the phone, no matter how good the story is. But we really need to do much more protection around this topic. And what's interesting is that young people educating other young people is far more effective than parents. And so that's where I think there needs to be more empowerment of responsible young people. And I know my son, he's about to have, it's actually his 22nd birthday. He's barely on social media anymore. He's working, and he realizes there's a lot of bad information coming all the time. It's like, why? And a lot of ads to buy things, and he doesn't have money. He wants to save it. So he's just like, less is more. So you do trainings for clinicians, Dr. C. You want to educate lawyers and judges.
And I do trainings for protective moms, a therapeutic intervention to help them, and protective dads. It's a protective parenting program to support them when they navigate this kind of dynamic in the family system with their children. They're the best therapists for children, frankly.
Yeah, good. So I feel like we've covered a lot. What did we miss? You mentioned Evan Stark and the concept of coercive control, and I think he was your mentor. Dr. C. You want to say anything about him and the law in the UK and what legal things are happening about that?
Sure. So we've criminalized coercive control in the UK, Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and England. And actually, Canada is very close to criminalizing coercive control, which is fantastic. In the United States, we've codified it as a form of domestic abuse that is not criminalization. Although there's a slight part in the California law or the Hawaii law, that is a misdemeanor, but it's really slight. And people are a little bit frustrated because they think these laws aren't doing anything. And I think it's like with any other law, it's going to take time. for things to take off the ground. I do know for sure in the UK, there has been huge changes. The UK, and we talk about this in our book, right, Amy, this idea about love bombing. You know, Amy and I created a small workshop, a short workshop, but it talks about how do abusers pull you in. It's the abuser's playbook, right? How do they maintain that control? And then if they think it's slipping through their grasp, how do they attempt to regain it, right? And in the UK, under the Crown, they actually added love bombing to this idea of coercive control. So there is an understanding, to your point, what you mentioned earlier is this, you know, narcissism, right? Narcissists are, you know, grandiose, all of these other things. But what we're really talking about in this book are people who are narcissistic abusers. They are coercive controllers. They want to exert power and control over other. They're probably part of the dark tetrad, you know, the narcissism, the Machiavellianism, the psychopathy, but also the sadistic behavior. And, you know, Amy and I just hope that people can pick up the book, read stories, become educated so that it doesn't happen to you. We can prevent this from happening to others, right, Amy? I mean, please feel free to elaborate.
No, absolutely. And I think we hope that people are educated at the end in our call to action about some of the legislation out there. I mean, Caden's law was passed in 2022. We're so grateful that we have Catherine Sherlock's story of her and her daughter. She's the only woman whose real name is used in the book because she's been so public, because sadly her daughter, Pennsylvania girl, was killed by her abusive father during unsupervised visits. So that law was passed nationally, but has to be passed in every state. It's passed in 7 states now. So people really can get involved on the state level and find the organizations that are helping to get Caden's law passed, for example, to protect children and protective parents going through this situation. 2 different laws, right? So one is codifying coercive control as a form of domestic abuse. And then Caden's law, violence against, what Amy's referencing, is another law that actually puts parameters on people, as Amy said, to be educated on what's the best interest of children, and preventing reunification camps also, which is really part of the conversation too. So if you're in a state and you don't have a law codifying coercive control yet, find your legislators. And those same legislators probably care enough to have Caden's law. Find those legislators and reach out to them. And we talk about that, as Amy said, in our call to action.
Yep. So, and for me, that's the foot in the door for the bigger frame of undue influence and mind control that I did my doctoral work on with the BITE model of authoritarian control. Because with that model, you can talk about a country, you can talk about a religious group, you can talk about a psychotherapist abuse situation. And for me, the domestic abuse coercive control is a subset of these same things. And with that, I'll tell you that my next research project as a scholar of Fielding Graduate University, a fellow, is I have about to launch the bitemodel.com website, and people can do an anonymous survey of 10 questions of behavior control, never to always, 10 questions of information, thought, and emotional control. And they can get a number on the influence continuum of how authoritarian the relationship with a group is. It's completely anonymous. There is a spot where you can say if you are in an organization, but you can also say other, and you can, say domestic abuse. And we want to gather data and say, this is the numbers we have on this phenomenon, and hopefully publish more academic papers, because that's how the law gets changed, because we want to show there's scientific consensus that these techniques, like love bombing, like isolating, like putting phobias in people's minds, etc., falls in this whole framework of undue influence. So with that, I want to tell my listeners, framed, Women in the Family Court Underworld, very important book. Get it. And I hope you'll be recording it maybe, or doing something with it because a lot of people listen to books these days in addition to reading it. And congratulations on your good work. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. We appreciate it.
Steve Hassan here. You know, it's been decades since my family rescued me from the Moonies. I've been at this for over 47 years. The need has never been greater. If you're able, please consider hitting the super thanks button below, and it'll help us to do better. Every penny will help us toward our goal of educating the planet about undue influence. Remember, it's your mind, only you should control.